Hello and welcome back to the channel where once again it's time for another Sega Saturn review. As today we take a look at a very early entry in the 3D beat-em-up genre in the form of Die Hard Arcade, which was originally released in the arcades in mid-1996 before coming home to the Saturn firstly in Japan as Dynamite Decker in January of 1997 before seeing release in PAL territories the following month in February and then finally seeing a release in North American regions in March of the same year. Like always, I'll be talking about how it performs visually in regards to sound effects and music, how it plays, content and lifespan, and then finally deciding whether it's a game that's still worth playing today or not, and also if it has the quality to enter into my Saturn PAL Top 10 or indeed my worldwide Top 10. The story for Die Hard Arcade is very loosely based on the original Die Hard movie, with you taking control of either John McClane or Chris Thompson as you try to save the president of Nakatomi Corporation's daughter, Missy Harrington, as she has been kidnapped inside the Nakatomi building by a group of terrorists led by the game's primary antagonist, Wolf Fang, as he tries to get his hands on the millions of dollars worth of bonds locked inside the building's vault. Once you hit the main menu, you'll see you've got a choice of the main game, Die Hard Arcade, the Deep Scan game, and also options. Heading into options and you can view the control pad layout as well as change a few settings, such as deciding whether you want movie scenes, friendly hits, or violence on or off. Like always, I'll start with the visuals first, and for a January 1997 release, Die Hard Arcade is actually quite a decent looking 3D game, not just by Saturn standards, but by console standards in general. The characters are relatively blocky, but have good levels of facial detail, and come across as being relatively tough and durable, which fits the style of the game very well. The stages, whilst not being particularly spectacular in any way, shape or form, are also reasonably good for the time period, and there is a reasonable amount of variation as you battle your way through the Nakatomi building, going through various rooms, corridors and the parking lot before finally reaching the very top of the building as you face off against the final boss. The animations for all of your physical attacks are relatively smooth and decent too, just like they are once you pick up objects and guns to use on your victims too. One nice touch that I do like with the game is the fact that as you progress through the stages, your character's clothing will become more and more battered and ripped in a similar fashion to John McClane's did in the actual Die Hard movie. You also get a nice swooping camera at times to create a somewhat cinematic feel, and as well as this, the game uses the in-game engine for all of the small cutscenes that take place within the game too. What this doesn't mean though is that the game is perfect, because it most certainly isn't. Textures in some area are of quite low quality and fairly pixelated, and despite the game feeling fairly solid overall, the game doesn't quite feel as polished as it potentially could, because there are a few glitches here and there. Whilst the performance of the game overall is very good too, with no real noticeable slowdown to myself at least anyway, even when multiple enemies are on screen, what the game does suffer from is a lot of loading screens between different areas, quick time events and also cutscenes, meaning it feels incredibly disjointed from a visual perspective, as some locations that you fight in will only involve very short battles, meaning the game is continually loading different areas, which is somewhat frustrating. Moving on to sound effects and music, and the quality of both of these is actually pretty good throughout the whole entire game. Sound effects for all of the weapons within the game are spot on. Explosions also sound very strong, just like all of your punch and kick attacks do as well, and you also get some cheesy sound effects when you're hit with things like a crotch kick. The voice acting within the game, although quite limited in terms of quantity, is undeniably poor and actually adds to the game's somewhat cheesy action movie style approach. In regards to the music, the game actually has quite a lot of tunes, with many of them feeling quite action-packed and dramatic and fitting of the amount of on-screen action that is taking place, with many of them having that 90s arcade style feeling to them. In fact, the one and only negative thing that I can say about the game in regards to the sound in general also relates to what I said about the visuals, with that being that as the game is constantly chopping and changing from different locations to quick time events and cutscenes, it means music is constantly stopping and starting too, which again gives the game a somewhat disrupted feel from a visual perspective as well as a sound perspective. But with that being said, it doesn't take away from any of the quality that the game has to offer in this area, so like always, I will give you some samples of the music within the game. In regards to gameplay, Die Hard Arcade was the first 3D beat-em up of this style to hit the consoles at the time, with games like Fighting Force, Nightmare Creatures and Crisis Beat all coming out sometime later on the PlayStation. The objective of the game is very simple, as you enter each area and simply need to defeat all of the enemies that appear on screen before moving on to the next area. There are bosses to take on and defeat throughout the game, as well as several quick time events too, which also break up the standard fighting action. In terms of how well it plays, with it being an incredibly early 3D beat-em up, the controls are not quite as fluid or fine-tuned as later games from this era. Whilst your characters can move in all directions, they can't freely move up and down the screen, so to speak, and instead simply shuffle up and down while still facing forwards or backwards, with all of the attacks in the game taking place horizontally. Once you've got used to this, the game is relatively enjoyable to play with a simple 3-button interface of punch, kick and jump, with both of the characters that you control having quite a decent variety of moves on offer, more similar to a standard one-on-one fighting game than your typical beat-em up. To go with your standard punch and kick combos, you can also execute running and jumping attacks, as well as grab style maneuvers that are incredibly similar to the ones that we'd seen in the previous generation of games like Streets of Rage. To go with this, there are also a plethora of items that can be picked up and used as weapons, including things like chairs, pipes and axes, to go with a decent amount of firearms too, such as pistols, machine guns and missile launchers, with these all being pretty satisfying to use. You can also replenish ammo for the items too, as enemies can drop a variety of items once defeated, although it's worth pointing out that only handgun clips and machine gun magazines can be stored and kept from scene to scene, as all other items that you may potentially be holding at the end of an area will simply be lost. The game is relatively difficult though, if not almost impossible, to play through on the standard amount of credits, as enemies can rip through your health incredibly quickly, and despite the fact that you can pick up health replenishing items, you will more than likely need to take part in the deep scan game prior to actually playing through Die Hard Arcade. What this is a very basic 1979 submarine-based game where you move your ship from side to side and try to eliminate as many submarines in the water as you can. Once you meet certain point targets, you can then gain additional credits to play through the main game with you simply being able to keep replaying Deep Scan until you feel you've got enough credits to finish the actual game with. It's worth pointing out though that once you play through Die Hard Arcade, your base number of credits will reset to the default amount, meaning you will have to play through Deep Scan once again to gain more additional credits for your next playthrough of the game. I will actually say though that Deep Scan is relatively addictive despite being incredibly basic, and it's actually quite a nice touch having something like this within the game rather than simply giving you the option of starting the game with as many credits as you like. In all fairness, the only real issue I have with the way it plays is once again the same thing that I have mentioned in terms of visuals and sound problems as well, because many of the areas that you fight through are incredibly short. You never really feel that you truly get into any kind of groove with the game because of the constant chopping and changing from scene to scene, and as you may have guessed from what I said already, this really does bring a level of frustration to the game on the whole. Moving on to content and lifespan, and it may well not come as a surprise when I say this is where Die Hard Arcade really comes up a cropper, as the game only takes around 20 minutes to play through from start to finish, making it quite possibly one of the very shortest games on the Sega Saturn. There are only 5 stages within the game, with several smaller areas making up each stage along with boss fights too. Indeed, the only way to make the playthrough time longer is to deliberately fail certain quick time events, which will force you to face off against a few additional enemies. Some areas that battles take place in will quite literally take you less than 1 minute to do before you move on to the next area, meaning the game is incredibly disjointed like I previously mentioned, and somewhat frustrating from start to finish. Of course, you do have the option of playing the game with 2 players, which inevitably does add to the enjoyment factor, as well as giving it a little bit more replay value too, as well as the fact that when you get to the final boss battle and defeat him, you must then face off against each other to determine who gets the sole credit for rescuing the Nakatomi President's daughter, very similar to what had been done in Double Dragon when that was released quite a few years previous. But even then, I'd struggle to say that Die Hard Arcade is a game that you would come back to time and time again to play through, simply because it is so short and has absolutely no alternative routes or stages to play through, along with no unlockable content within the game either, meaning it really does feel like a bare bones experience. What I will say though is that the Deep Scan game does have a little bit of replay value, at least due to it being somewhat addictive, and also the kind of game where you could take it in turns with a friend trying to play and beat each other's scores, and is actually an example of something being incredibly basic and simplistic, but actually still being somewhat addictive. On the whole though, it really is quite difficult to say anything positive about Die Hard Arcade in regards to content and lifespan, and with somewhat similar 1997 releases on the PlayStation such as Fighting Force and even Nightmare Creatures offering so much more, I genuinely feel that Die Hard Arcade should have had additional stages, modes of play, or additional unlockable content of some form to add more meat on the bones. So like always, that leaves me with my 2 final questions. Is Die Hard Arcade still worth playing nowadays, and does it have the quality to potentially enter into my PAL Top 10 or even my worldwide Top 10? In regards to whether Die Hard Arcade is still worth playing, whilst it's still relatively enjoyable when you're on screen beating up all the terrorists with anything that you can get your hands on, the fact that the game is so disjointed and incredibly short mean there really isn't much incentive to go out of your way to play this game nowadays. Indeed, if you are a fan of scrolling beat-em-ups from this era, then you will probably get slightly more enjoyment from PlayStation games like Fighting Force, Crisis Beat, or Gekido, as in terms of Saturn games there really isn't anything similar on the system, as the Saturn version of Fighting Force was cancelled partway through production, never to be completed, although the Saturn does have the fantastic 2-dimensional scrolling beat-em-up in the form of Guardian Heroes, which in many people's eyes is better than all of the games I previously mentioned. Of course, that leads me on to my final question. Does Die Hard Arcade have the quality to enter into my PAL Top 10 or my worldwide Top 10? And you will probably have already guessed the answer to that, with that answer being no. it simply doesn't have enough of anything to challenge any of the games in either top 10, but at the same time it's also nowhere near anything in the Saturn bottom 10 either. I actually think the reviews from the time period were pretty accurate, with it scoring around 7 out of 10 on average in most multi-format magazines, and even the official Sega Saturn magazine only awarding it 80%, with them being known to be fairly biased as well. But like always, these are my thoughts and my thoughts alone, and I am well aware that there are many Saturn owners out there who hold Die Hard Arcade in very high regard, but I do wonder if many of those people have gone back to play it in recent times, as I don't think it holds up as well as many people may remember. So let me know your thoughts on Die Hard Arcade down below, and also consider subscribing if you're new to the channel as we chase 5,000 subscribers, and like always, I'll be back in the near future with another Saturn review. Goodbye for now.